Each year, the Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, near San Diego, California, hosts one of the world's biggest air shows. Millions of people have watched some of the world's best display teams and pilots, flying a huge range of aircraft. Among them, has been a small swept-wing jet, painted in the bright colors of its sponsors, streaking across the sky. The jet was a Russian MiG-17. Its appearance at Miramar might have seemed to some ironic. During the Vietnam War, they became the scourge of American pilots. In fact, the Navy was losing so many planes to the little MiGs, that a new school was created, based at Miramar. Its mission was to train a new breed of pilot in tactics, that many thought belonged to an earlier era. It was called the Navy Fighter Weapons School. Today it is more simply known as Top Gun. The story of Top Gun begins in the years after the end of the Second World War. The world was divided between Western liberal democracies and countries dominated by communist ideologies. Both sides had nuclear arsenals and large fleets of bombers to deliver them. Although there was a standoff between the superpowers of Soviet Russia, China, and the United States, they found themselves involved in proxy wars in Southeast Asia. On July 27, 1953, the war on the Korean Peninsula ended with an uneasy armistice. It was one of the most bloody conflicts of modern times. The war in the air had begun with once powerful aircraft of World War II vintage like the P-51 Mustang. But the days of powerful propeller-driven aircraft were over. The jet was the new master of the skies. The jets gave the forces supporting South Korea a major advantage. By controlling the skies, the bombers could do their work with impunity. But in late October 1950, the Chinese intervened and provided the North Koreans with MiG-15s. The MiG-15 was small and maneuverable, and was one of the most advanced jet fighters of the day. The tables were turned. Bombers now had to fly at night, making their attacks less accurate. But the MiG's ascendancy was short-lived. In response, the U.S. Air Force sent over its latest fighter, the F-86 Sabre. Although heavily outnumbered, the Sabres came to dominate the skies over Korea. The United States Air Force claimed that the success ratio was as high as 10 MiGs lost for every Sabre. It seemed American pilots were the new masters of air-to-air combat. But change was in the air. It was the height of the Cold War against Soviet Russia. Further up the chain of command, there was a belief that stopping Soviet bombers was the priority. A new airplane was drawn up. It was designed to fire missiles at planes that were so far away that the pilot couldn't even see the target. To help him, a second crew was added to operate the radar and weapons. The Navy called them Radar Intercept Officers, or RIOs. On the 3rd of July 1959, a ceremony was held at the McDonnell Douglas plant in St. Louis, to name the Navy's new plane. It was called the F-4 Phantom. Its performance was so good, that both the Air Force and Marines also ordered versions. By the mid-60s, the Phantom had become their major fighter.
The entire focus of the Air Force in the late 50s and early 60s was against the Soviet bomber threat. We thought they would come and bomb Los Angeles, and they built a Phantom to counter that threat.
You can't really anticipate what it's going to be like until you've done it. I mean, the power and yet the responsiveness is very, very light on the controls. I mean, you just think, go there, and you're there.
April 1965. Many Americans might not have heard of the Gulf of Tonkin, but a clash off the coast of Vietnam saw America drawn into a civil war in its fight against the spread of communism. As the U.S. Navy built up its forces in the Gulf of Tonkin, it launched over 60 attacks against North Vietnam. In response, the North Vietnamese moved their MiGs south of Hanoi. Their task was to attack the bombers and force them to drop their bombs before they reached their targets. Under rules of engagement, the Americans were forbidden to attack their airfields. If they wanted to keep their air superiority, the Americans had to engage the MiGs in air combat. The Phantoms were deployed as fighter escorts. The Americans did not consider these small MiGs a match for their more modern fighters. In spring 1965, 3 carriers of the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet guarded the Gulf of Tonkin. It had 200 aircraft at its disposal. The North Vietnamese had between 30 and 40 fighters. Most of these were MiG-17s. The MiG-17 was a development of the very successful MiG-15. Although many American pilots considered it an outdated design, it had great maneuverability, especially at low altitudes. It showed that it could defeat all of the more modern American planes. That same year, the North Vietnamese took delivery of their first MiG-21s. Supersonic and armed with air-to-air missiles, the MiG-21 was more than a match for the Phantoms. During the first week of March 1965, America widened its involvement in Vietnam, with a series of airstrikes against North Vietnamese targets. It was codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder, and ran until October 1968. The operation began badly, with 2 F-8 Crusaders badly damaged by MiGs, and 2 F-105s shot down. The following month, 4 U.S. Navy Phantoms encountered MiGs for the first time. 1 MiG was shot down, but it was a hollow victory, as a Phantom was also shot down by one of the other American pilots. The encounter showed up a major problem in the reliability of the air-to-air missiles. 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders and 8 AIM-7 Sparrow missiles were fired during the encounter, but only one hit its target and the others malfunctioned. The loss of a Phantom to friendly fire led to changes in the rules of engagement. Pilots now had to visually confirm their target before firing. The combination of this, and the poor reliability, meant that the Phantoms now had to engage the MiGs in close combat, something it was not designed for. The Phantom may have been the right plane, but it was in the wrong war. The problem was made worse by the fact that pilots received almost no training in air combat.
It was ironic that the importance of air-to-air eyeball-to-eyeball combat in aerial maneuvering as a primary function of gaining and maintaining air superiority was so soon discounted after both World War II and the Korean conflict.
You had to close with him, you had to identify him, had to learn how to dogfight, something that every pilot has had to do since World War I. We hadn't been trained to do that.
At the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914, aircraft were used for reconnaissance. Pilots occasionally took potshots at one another with their pistols, but beyond that, there was little contact beyond exchanging a cheery wave. But barely 2 months later, all that changed. French pilot Louis Queneau succeeded in shooting down a German machine, with a machine gun mounted on his own plane. It was history's first air-to-air kill. Tactics began to evolve, as both sides learned that control of the skies was an important military objective. By 1915, Germany was sending out planes in packs of 4 to ambush Allied pilots. In response, Britain's Royal Flying Corps issued orders that reconnaissance aircraft were to be escorted by 3 fighters at all times. It was the dawn of the dogfight. A new breed of hero was born in the skies over the Western Front, the fighter ace. Their lives were short, but they were celebrated as heroes. As the tactics of air combat evolved, German ace, Oswald Boelcke, wrote the world's first manual on air combat. The principles he outlined still ring true. Secure all possible advantage before attacking. If you initiate an attack, follow it through. Fire only at close range. Keep your eye on your opponent. Attack your opponent from behind. If your opponent dives to attack you, turn to meet him. Always remember your line of retreat. Fight in groups of 4 to 6 and avoid several aircraft attacking the same target. Ironically, Boelcke met his fate after colliding with another German plane, as they both attacked the same target. He died ignoring his own advice. Within a generation, the fighter made a quantum leap forward as engines became more reliable and powerful. In the First World War, 2 enemies who were 2 miles apart met in half a minute. In the Second World War, it was 10 seconds. But the fundamental rules of air combat remained the same.
The only doctrine we had was to get as close to the airplane as possible and to shoot and to make certain that we weren't being looked at ourselves. But that was the only doctrine we got, get in close and fire as little as possible, but effectively as possible.
height is essential. Don't hang around in the skies, congratulating yourself and so on. Never fly straight and level in the combat area. Get in, hit the bombers hard, and get out again. Don't hang around, and keep your eyes open all the time. That's about the basics of the thing, and if you did that, then you stood a better chance of getting away with it. I think a lot of chaps did just simply, having attacked, thought, well, that's it, let's go home, and they didn't make it.
By the Vietnam War, the lessons of dogfighting were 50 years old, but no one was teaching them.
They saw dogfighting as an old-fashioned way of doing things.
The need for visual identification meant that planes had to get in close before engaging. As Sidewinders and Sparrows were designed for long-range attack, they continued to be ineffective. A report summed up the problem.
There is a need for a close-in weapon as a backup on any missile system. If an ID pass has to be made, aircraft should have a weapon to give them an immediate attack capability if the target proved hostile.
Many pilots wanted a new missile for short-range combat. Others campaigned for a gun, even though there were concerns that this would tempt some pilots into dangerous situations.
You had made a mistake if you got into a dogfight as such. If you got into a turning battle, because the MiG-17 could outturn you. If you could get the MiG-21 down low and make him start turning, then he would run out of energy quickly. He bled off, bled off his energy. And you could fight him down low, but don't try that up high.
The Air Force responded by fitting a cannon in a pod underneath the fuselage. With no gun sight, it was wildly inaccurate. The Navy continued to rely on its missiles. Pilots' complaints about the Phantom's poor maneuverability continued to mount, as did the casualties. The Phantom was unable to cope with the tight turning, subsonic speeds of air combat over Vietnam.
We were fighting the wrong war, with the wrong training and the wrong equipment.
Pilots also identified a lack of air combat training.
Fighting a MiG-17 in an F-4 was like being a giant with a long rifle trapped in a phone booth with a midget using a knife.
In the fleet, the training program was all intercept, protect the carrier, long-range missiles, that sort of thing. There was little air-to-air maneuvering.
A would-be F-4 fleet pilot was lucky to get 2 ACM hops in the intercept-dominated syllabus. Few knew what they were doing, and those who did got little out of it. They were a blur, and the big thing was not to crash into each other.
We really didn't have any tactics. I knew if we got involved with MiGs it might be a hairy situation, and what we had to do is be prepared to get our shots and get out. We weren't prepared to fight with them.
The Navy had not completely abandoned training in air combat maneuvers. At the start of the war, the F-8 Crusader was the Navy's air superiority fighter. It was highly maneuverable and carried guns. But the stress of air combat on aging airframes was taking its toll. As the Crusaders were retired, air superiority was added to the Phantom cruise roles. But the Phantom also had a major flaw. In certain tight turning angles, the loss of speed meant that the pilot could lose control of his plane, sometimes fatally. To avoid accidents, dangerous maneuvers were removed from training. What little air combat training new Phantom pilots got was of little value, as they only flew against similar aircraft. The training created an expectation among new pilots that the MiGs would react like American planes. These pilots did not discover the errors of their assumptions until their lives were at stake in battle in the skies over Vietnam. The kill ratio tumbled to just over 2-to-1, a long way from the 12-to-1 claimed by pilots during the Korean War just 10 years earlier. Navy pilots were still shooting down twice as many planes as the enemy, but every time one Phantom went down, 2 crewmen were killed or captured.
The kill ratio was 2-to-1. You understand what I mean? They would get one of us for every 2 enemy we would shoot down. The average was 12-to-1 in the Second World War and 12-to-1 in Korea, so we were doing miserably.
In late 1967, Phantoms launched 55 Sparrows without a single hit. Worse, the Phantom's smoky engines made it easy to spot. It was clear that there were 2 major problems for the Navy pilots. Firstly, why were the missiles so unreliable? And secondly, if the tactics used by the Phantom pilots were not suitable for dogfighting, how could their training be improved? The task of studying the problems was handed to the skipper of the USS Coral Sea, Captain Frank Holt. He was the ideal man for the job as he had seen the problems firsthand. In 2 years his pilots had failed to shoot down a single MiG. Early in 1968, the fighting intensified as North Vietnam launched its Tet Offensive.
We were stuck in a war, whether we liked it or not, in which there was a lot of fighting and not much winning.
There was street fighting in Saigon and 100 other cities and towns across South Vietnam. The attackers were pushed back at high cost. But it was a hollow victory. Americans wanted an end to the war and began looking for a way out. Rolling Thunder, the bombing campaign meant to force the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table, was suspended. But not before another 2 Phantoms and their crews were brought down by MiGs. In the first incident in May, 5 Navy Phantoms pounced on 2 MiG-21s. In the dogfight that followed, the Phantoms fired 3 missiles to no effect. But a MiG shot down a Phantom. A month later, another Phantom was shot down. 1 crew was killed, the other taken prisoner. Frank Holt realized that his review needed to look at all aspects of the weapon system. Its design, delivery, maintenance and crucially, how the weapon was used in combat. It took just 3 months for Holt and his team to come up with over 100 recommendations. One of the more startling findings was how the missiles were handled. Landing a plane on an aircraft carrier deck is brutal on an aircraft and complex systems like the missiles. Yet, they were being manhandled as if they were old-fashioned iron bombs.
They found out that Sparrows and Sidewinders were put on aircraft and do 25 to 40 landings at a time before they were taken off the airplane and even taken down to the shop to analyze. And 2 or 3 landings is enough to jog the gyro and the electronics of the Sparrows and Sidewinders to negate its capability of firing.
Even if the missiles were not duds, Holt found that many crews failed to even arm their missiles due to the many switches needed to arm and fire them. The report described the pilots fighting in a heads-up environment with heads-down cockpit displays. A process not suited for tight-turning dogfighting in which opportunities relied on split-second decision-making. The report also noted that missiles were being launched outside of their operational limits. But the most far-reaching of Alt's recommendations was the need to establish an advanced fighter weapons school, with a corps of instructors, to revive the lost art of air combat maneuvering or dogfighting. Frank Alt delivered his hard-hitting report in January 1969. Its recommendations were hard to deny. Top Gun was born. But there was still the where, who, and how. Captain Alt had already identified the location. Navy Air Station Miramar, or Fighter Town, as they liked to call it back then, was already home to the Replacement Air Group, which was the training squadron for the Pacific Fleet. The unit's commander, Lieutenant Commander Dan Pedersen, was given the task of setting up the new school.
Fellow named Sam Leeds was a contemporary of mine in the squadron, came to me and said, "I've got something to show you," and he gave me the Alt report. And I read it, and he said, "How would you like to take charge and put together the graduate school that's defined in here?" They say do it as quickly as you can. The war is going on, you know, you're dealing in human life there. We knew we were all going to go again. We knew what the problem was.
Dan Pedersen faced an uphill challenge. He had a limited budget and no building to run a new school from. And they gave him just 60 days to get the whole thing up and running. But he wasn't about to give up.
I was able to provide assets and cut through red tape, and acquire things as we needed them. And I used to like to say things like they were, and so they had to defend me occasionally. But all in all, we had to steal whatever we had.
Although Fighter Town was full up, they found enough space to put an old double-width trailer.
Our friends and rivals at Miramar who flew the older F-8 Crusader, called themselves the last of the gunfighters. Soon, we started calling the school Top Gun.
Meanwhile, Dan Pedersen used his contacts to handpick 9 pilots and RIOs to be the school's first instructors. Each one was expected to have exceptional technical knowledge in one specific area, be it 1-versus-1 maneuvering or the intricacies of radar-guided missiles. Where necessary, they too received specialized training. They were, after all, teaching aviators who would be taking the lessons into combat. Excellent stick and throttle skill would enable them to challenge students, who were flying what were in many ways more advanced aircraft. It also reinforced Top Gun's philosophy that a skilled and well-trained aircrew could overcome any disadvantages in aircraft and weapons. The Defense Intelligence Agency had set up a project to obtain and evaluate the MiG-21, in order to find out its strengths and weaknesses. Called Constant Peg, the program was until recently highly classified. But in 1967, an operation called Hebdonut delivered a MiG-21. It had been flown to Israel by a defecting Iraqi Air Force pilot. The Israelis had been trying to upgrade its air force with Phantoms, but had been blocked. But the MiG-21 gave them a strong bargaining chip. And so a deal was struck, which enabled the Israelis to buy their Phantoms, in exchange for the use of the MiG for 3 months. In January 1968, the MiG made its first flight from Groom Lake, Nevada, otherwise known as Area 51. the MiG was put through an intense series of flights, as well as mock dogfights with American planes, to analyze its performance, flight envelope and systems. Within 4 months of the end of the program, the Americans struck gold a second time. 2 Syrian MiG-17s on a navigation exercise got lost and landed at an Israeli base by accident. In Operation Half Thrill and Half Ferry, the MiG-17s were again delivered to Groom Lake for more exhaustive testing. In many ways, acquiring the MiG-17 was more important, because though slow and dated, it was nimble, and the main adversary type American pilots encountered in the skies over Vietnam. In mock combat with the Little MiG, not one American Phantom pilot came out on top on their first sortie.
To a man, people who came up against one for the first time, everyone said they had never seen an aircraft turn like that in my life. Better that they should see that in the western United States than over Hanoi.
There was much to relearn in the art of dogfighting. Although the MiG program was wound down during 1969, the Constant Peg project continued in great secrecy. It was only in 1989 that a Pentagon official confirmed that in 1981, combat between 2 U.S. Navy F-14 Tomcats and 2 Libyan Sukhoi Su-17 fighters over the Gulf of Sidra, that the tactics used had been developed out of mock combat testing with Soviet fighters, flown by American pilots. From the outset, flying mock combat sorties against planes different to the pilot's own was at the core of the Top Gun syllabus. It would revitalize the art of dogfighting at a time when it seemed that it had been all but forgotten. As they didn't have enough MiG-17s, the instructors flew Douglas A-4 Skyhawks in the aggressor role. Skyhawks had been in Navy service since 1966. As fighter bombers, they had been very successful, but were becoming vulnerable to the MiGs. But the small size of the Skyhawk, and superb low-speed handling in the hands of a skilled instructor, made it ideal to teach Navy pilots the finer points of dissimilar air combat training, or DACT. Skyhawks continued to play the aggressors at Top Gun right up until the 1990s. As well as Skyhawks, the instructors had aircraft from the Northrop T-38 series, which had a similar performance envelope as the MiG-21. The T-38 was followed in the aggressor role by its single-seater fighter development, the T-5 Tiger. Fans of the first Top Gun movie will recognize these as the renamed MiG-28s that Maverick and Iceman confront in the movie's climax. In the skies over Nevada, the mock combat showed that although the MiGs were more maneuverable, they also had shortcomings of their own. The most significant was that the MiG pilot couldn't see what was under his nose due to the size of the jet intake. The MiG-21 pilots were also disadvantaged by poor rearward visibility. The instructors also devised a new maneuver, designed to exploit the Phantom's prodigious rate of climb.
Phantoms had great power, so we could outfly the MiGs in terms of speed. So we decided to go straight up, go above them and fly down to a perfect position behind the MiG, and go for a tail shot. Then, with tactics like that, we were getting 24 of the enemies for every one of us.
You're fighting ground is shaped like an egg. You go up in the vertical, you come back over, you get nose to tail. You just don't get slow with this MiG. You do it with what you got.
But the Top Gun instructors also rediscovered some old lessons from the early days of dogfighting. Fighting in pairs.
The loose-deuce formation, as we call it, two airplanes flying side by side. You can maneuver out of the formation in place or you can cross-turn. A lot of things you can do. We didn't develop them, that had been done before. If you were an adversary you had to pick one or the other, or once you were committed to one you became vulnerable to the other. So now we began to work in unison. And one may actually set himself up to be a target. And as the adversary came in to attack him, the other could roll in and take advantage of the situation.
After each combat session, the crews were debriefed. Young fighter pilots are naturally competitive, and so the debriefs were designed to be accurate and thoughtful, with an emphasis on what could be learned rather than point scoring. It was an approach that reduced the risk of alienating students, as well as keeping egos in check. But would Top Gun produce the results the Navy wanted? The only way Dan Pedersen and his instructors were going to find out was to go and talk to squadron commanders, and try and persuade them to send their best crews and ground teams to Miramar. They also had to bring their own aircraft. Some commanders considered it too much of a burden to lose their best crews when they were working up for deployment to Vietnam. Others considered it unnecessary. It was down to Dan Pedersen and his instructors to prove them wrong. In April 1969, after 4 weeks of intense training, 9 pilots graduated from the first class of Top Gun. Any aircrew would improve after 4 weeks of intense flying and training, but the whole point of Top Gun was to produce aviators that could pass on their knowledge back on their squadrons. But it would be some time before the Navy would find out if the methods taught by Top Gun worked. Talks in Paris aimed at ending the conflict in Vietnam dragged on with little sign of progress. But in early 1972, the stalemate was broken, as North Vietnamese forces invaded the South. In response, America resumed its air war against the North's supply lines and materials. Navy pilots were once again engaging MiGs. Before the bombing halt in 1968, the Navy's kill-to-loss ratio was just over 2-to-1, 1 aircraft and crew lost for every 2 enemy shot down. Once the air war resumed in full, the ratio climbed to nearly 13-to-1. Most of the MiG kills were by graduates of Top Gun.
What the training did for me is it kept my feet on the ground. It kept me thinking properly. I didn't get buck fever. You know all the things that are going to happen to you before you get there. You got a whole bag of tricks.
Although the Vietnam War ended in 1975, Top Gun kept refining its teaching, in the face of ever-changing weapons and new aircraft. By then, the Phantom's days were numbered as the Navy's main combat aircraft. It had served the Navy well in all the roles it had been designed to carry out. Even the plane's shortcomings as a close-range dogfighter that had led to the creation of Top Gun had been significantly improved. Following the experience gained during the Vietnam War, the Phantom was replaced by the Grumman F-14 Tomcat. The first squadrons and Top Gun began receiving their Tomcats from 1974. Its most striking feature was its variable wing geometry. Fully swept back, the Tomcat could fly at twice the speed of sound and soar to 30,000 feet in 1 minute. With its wings forward, it could fly and maneuver at slow speeds, which was a vast improvement over the Phantom. It could carry up to 6 half-ton Phoenix missiles, which could home in on a bomber 100 miles away, as well as track other multiple targets at the same time. The weapons systems had also been upgraded in the cockpit, given a more logical layout. The Rio could now spend less time looking down at switches spread almost randomly around the cockpit. It even had a gun. The crew could now enjoy great all-around vision thanks to the bubble canopy, a great advantage for landing on a busy carrier deck. But for all its strengths, the Tomcat came with its own problems. Firstly, its size was enormous for a fighter. Its wings and fuselage stretched to over 60 feet, and once the crew were aboard, they found themselves 20 feet off the ground. The F-14 was also the most expensive fighter of its time. But worse, it gained a reputation for poor engine reliability.
When I got to NAS Miramar for training, I was surprised at 1. How big the jet was, and 2. How dirty many Tomcats were, with footprints, greasy smudges, and leaking fluids. First impressions? Large and complex.
For the F-14 crews coming through Top Gun, there had been some changes. By the end of the war in Vietnam, Top Gun had proved its worth. In 1972, the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, was formally commissioned as an entirely separate command. Top Gun no longer had to operate out of an old trailer. Now, it had a suite of offices and classrooms in Hangar 1 at Miramar. By the 1980s, the course had been extended to 5 weeks as new tactics had to be devised to make the most of improvements in missile technology. For example, missiles could now be fired at the front quarter of an approaching plane. But a new aircraft, the MiG-23, was also becoming more numerous in Soviet and other air forces. It posed a new threat, needing new tactics in both defense and offense. Work on finding a replacement for the MiG-21 had begun during the 1960s. Although it was fast and agile, the MiG-21's capabilities were limited by its primitive radar, short range, and small weapons load. The MiG-23 had a new weapon system that enabled it to fight beyond visual range. Like the F-14, the MiG-23 had variable geometry wings, but it was poor at turning. However, it had great speed and could simply accelerate away and come back in at another angle. The aggressor squadrons were still operating the A-4 and F-5 to simulate the MiG-23. Although the simulations of older threats like the MiG-17 were no longer required.
We taught the guys that if you were defensive with a flogger right behind you, then you were automatically offensive, because even the worst pilot in the world would be able to deny him a shot. You would turn, and he would try and turn with you, but he would never be able to turn the same corner as you.
At Top Gun, instructors flying as aggressors in dissimilar air combat training continued to fly the A-4s and F-5s, adapting their tactics to mirror those of the MiG-23. The Navy had expanded the number of adversary squadrons at bases around the country so that more tactical squadrons could benefit from the valuable training. Top Gun was the lead for adversary standardization, helping to ensure uniformly high quality throughout the fleet. By the 1990s, Top Gun was running 4 9-week courses a year. The need to expand the length of the course was partially driven by the fact that the F-14's role had been expanded to include ground attack. Training for air-to-air combat remained at the core of Top Gun's training. In the 1980s, Top Gun's A-4s and F-5s were very good simulators of threat aircraft that were built in the 1960s and 70s. But they were simply inadequate to simulate threats from the emerging fourth generation of jets, like the MiG-29. These aircraft were designed to be fast and agile. Innovations such as fly-by-wire and thrust vectoring made these planes extraordinarily maneuverable. Dogfighting was back on the agenda. The aging A-4s were retired, and the Navy began the search for a replacement for the F-5 to fill the adversary role. At the same time, the U.S. Air Force had been looking for a small, cheap, maneuverable airplane to flank the F-15 Eagle, its air superiority fighter, and face the small Soviet fighters in close combat. The plane they chose was the F-16 Fighting Falcon, also known as the Viper. For the Navy, the F-16 was the perfect adversary fighter, and 26 single and two-seat versions were ordered and delivered during the late 1980s. The Navy worked its F-16s hard. Top Gun instructors began flying alongside the students, as this gave them an even better picture of their performance. Against the Tomcat, the nimble Viper was a challenging adversary. Its airframe was designed to withstand up to 9G, that's 9 times the force of gravity, and more than any other fighter aircraft. Even though the F-16 is a relatively aging aircraft, its usefulness in the adversary role has been kept up through a series of updates. It has also been very adaptable, so that it can carry different radar, sensors, electronic warfare pods and other technologies, depending on the profile it's adopting for a particular mission. But the F-16 was not adopted for full naval service, as it was not sturdy enough for carrier operations. The Navy needed a small, light fighter, like the F-16, to complement the F-14. While the F-16 was being developed, Northrop and McDonnell Douglas developed the F/A-18 Hornet to take advantage of the new technologies like fly-by-wire used on the F-16. The result was a highly maneuverable plane, capable of flying a range of missions. It was also very reliable. When, in the early 1990s, the Navy was faced with replacing its aging fleet of A-6 Intruders and A-7 Crusaders, the solution was to design a bigger, more powerful Hornet, the Super Hornet. The Super Hornet entered Navy service in 1999, and gradually filled the roles of the A-6 and A-7 as well as the F-14. In 1996, several Marine and Navy bases were closed as cost-saving measures. As a result, Miramar was transferred to the Marine Corps. Top Gun was merged into the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center, based at Naval Air Station Fallon in Nevada. Today, Top Gun runs 3 strike fighter tactics instructor classes a year.
Our instructors go through a rigorous training regimen that includes subject matter research, doctorate-level writing and lectures that are part of our ground school. Our instructors also train in the aircraft, so that we are able to bring in graduate-level students, and still challenge them, taking their training to the next level. Almost immediately after finishing Top Gun, our graduates will go back to the fleet concentration centers, and take the cutting-edge knowledge they achieved through the 13-week course, and start training the next generation of aviators there. It's a master's level program, where those master's students go back and train the undergraduates and graduates in the fleet.
Attending Top Gun as a student is highly competitive, and the most sought-after qualification in a fighter squadron. Selection to return as a Top Gun instructor is even more exclusive, especially for Marines. As a student, I convinced myself that I had to be flawless if I was going to become one of the 3 Marine Corps pilots on the staff. I thought what made the instructors exceptional was that they never made any mistakes.
Going through the Top Gun course was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done. It was grueling. It was 13 weeks of pain, but everybody had the same goal, and they had the same determination and drive. We all just kind of leaned on each other at that point and we looked to each other for motivation.
At the debrief that followed every hour-long flight, pilots and instructors alike would spend up to 8 hours together, acknowledging and openly dissecting their every mistake. We did this because we knew that although good pilots make mistakes, the best pilots are the ones who recognize and fix them. This is the skill that matters most, that saves lives in combat, and ensures we win.
Some of the flying we do is a bit more risky, but being able to execute those tactics? That's an extremely fulfilling experience.
The whole goal of Top Gun is we essentially teach the teachers, and that's been true since our founding over 50 years ago.
Most of the training has been focused on the F/A-18 Hornet and Super Hornet. During each course, crews can expect 80 hours of lectures and flight 25 sorties.
Our mission is to train the best fighter aircrews we could possibly train. Prepare them to the utmost of our abilities so that they can win in combat. We want to push them to the limit as much as we can. We do here on a day-to-day basis what every fighter pilot in the world wants to do, and that's to go out and fight airplanes.
But a new type of aircraft has meant that the syllabus has had to be significantly revised. The F-35C, Lightning II, has introduced a whole new level of capability into the Navy, not least because it features an arsenal of stealth technology. The Navy has also been working for several years to develop the curriculum and instructors needed to integrate the carrier variant into the course, while gradually introducing its tactics into classes. Today, the first F-35C pilots to complete Top Gun are now taking their places in frontline squadrons. What began as a course run on a shoestring has developed into the world's best air combat school. But lessons are always in danger of being forgotten.
It's going to take innovative foresight, thinking and people who continue reminding us that when it comes down to war, airplanes sooner or later are going to look at airplanes in the air and they've got to shoot each other down.